In the quiet suburb of Greenwood Oaks, where white fences framed blooming front yards and wind chimes swayed gently in the breeze, there was a house that had long since been forgotten by its owners. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the backyard was overgrown with wild weeds that had claimed dominion over everything. Neighbors rarely glanced in that direction anymore. It had simply become part of the scenery, neglected, quiet, and easy to ignore. But behind that rusted gate, amidst the tangle of weeds and overturned lawn chairs, lived a secret. Or rather, someone who had once been cherished, but was now lost to time. George. He was a sulcata tortoise, one of the largest tortoise species in the world, though you wouldn't know it by looking at him. George was stunted from years of poor care. His shell was dull and cracked in places, his eyes were sunken, and he moved with the kind of slowness that wasn't just natural, but weary. He lived in a small, cracked tank once meant for a reptile a fraction of his size, shoved in a corner of the backyard behind a pile of rotting wood. The tank was only partially covered, exposing George to the beating sun in summer and the chill winds in winter. The water bowl was empty most of the time, and mold clung to the edges of the tank like stubborn moss. He hadn't seen a human face in weeks. George had not always lived this way. Once, long ago, he'd belonged to a young boy named Ryan. The boy had been gentle, curious, and filled with wonder when he first held George in his tiny palms. They'd been inseparable in those early years. George remembered warm hands, leafy treats, and afternoons in the sun where Ryan would sit beside him and chatter about dinosaurs, school, or dreams of becoming a scientist. But children grow older, and life pulls families in different directions. Eventually, Ryan left for college. His parents, once half-hearted caretakers, saw George as a relic of childhood. At first, they kept up with feeding him now and then, but as time passed, George became just another forgotten task on a never-ending list. When the family moved out, leaving the house vacant, George stayed behind. Forgotten completely. Until one spring afternoon, when the wind carried the sound of a car door slamming, and a new voice broke the silence. "Whoa, what is that?" It was Lily McKenna, a volunteer from a local animal welfare group. She and her team had been alerted by a neighbor who said they thought there was an old turtle or something living in the yard of the abandoned house. Lily had expected to find a garden statue or maybe a pond turtle that had wandered off. She hadn't expected George. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping closer. "That's a sulcata, and he's still alive." George stirred faintly as Lily crouched beside his tank. His vision was cloudy, but he could make out the shape of someone, a someone who smelled different than the rest. She had kind eyes and moved slowly, not like the raccoons that sometimes rattled his enclosure at night or the mockingbirds that swooped down, looking for insects. "Hey, buddy," she said gently, reaching in to touch the rim of his shell. "We're gonna get you out of here." And just like that, George's world changed. Lily and her team worked quickly. They assessed George's condition, gently lifted him out of the tank, and placed him in a large crate lined with soft towels. George barely moved. He was so dehydrated and malnourished he couldn't lift his head. His legs trembled under his own weight. But in his dark, tortoise heart, something stirred. A flicker. The beginning of hope. Back at the Animal Rescue Center, George was placed in a spacious enclosure with fresh hay, a heat lamp, and clean water. A vet examined him, tutting over his cracked shell, his calcium deficiency, his brittle nails. His shell, once meant to be proud and high-domed, was sunken and rough, showing signs of years of metabolic bone disease. But the vet was kind, and she named him formally in his files. "George," Lily had said. "Because he looks like he's been through a war, but he's still holding on." Days passed in slow trickles. George was given proper food, dark leafy greens, squashes, the occasional piece of fruit. His water was changed regularly. For the first time in years, his enclosure smelled like life, not mildew. And Lily came by often, sometimes sitting with him for half an hour, reading aloud from whatever book she'd brought that day. The staff didn't expect miracles. Tortoises were resilient, yes, but George had been severely neglected for too long. They feared the damage might be too great. But George surprised them. After 2 weeks, he started lifting his head more frequently. He'd drag himself over to the heat lamp and bask for hours, soaking up the warmth that he'd been denied for so long. He began to eat with more vigor. The first time Lily caught him crunching down on a chunk of cactus, she let out an involuntary cheer. "You stubborn old guy," she grinned. "You really want to stick around, don't you?" George blinked at her slowly. He didn't understand her words, but he understood tone, and this one carried something he hadn't felt in years: care. As weeks turned to months, George steadily gained weight. His shell hardened, at least in parts, and a healthy sheen returned to his eyes. He started walking with more confidence, exploring every inch of his enclosure. He had toys now, tunnels, ramps, and even a large mirror that fascinated him endlessly. Occasionally, he'd butt his head against it, as if trying to understand the tortoise on the other side. He even had friends, of a sort. Other rescued reptiles lived in nearby enclosures, and while they didn't exactly form a club, George seemed to enjoy their presence. He had found a place in the world again. And yet, Lily knew something still wasn't right. "George needs more than this," she said one day to her supervisor. "He's recovering great, but he doesn't belong in a glass-walled life. He's a sulcata, he needs land, real land." Which was why, one late summer afternoon, George found himself loaded into the back of a van bound for a very different destination. As the vehicle rolled out of the rescue center, the trees thickened, the air grew warmer, and the buildings gave way to fields. George, nestled in a bed of hay in his crate, felt the hum of the road beneath him. He didn't know where he was going, but he felt ready. It was the start of something new. The sanctuary was nothing like the life George had known before. No glass walls, no cracked plastic tank, no mildew-cloaked corners or the distant thrum of city life. As the back doors of the van swung open, the golden light of early evening poured in, flooding George's senses with sights and scents he hadn't encountered in years, if ever. He blinked slowly, adjusting to the light. Before him stretched acres of warm earth, patches of wild grass, rocky outcrops, and soft mounds of dirt perfect for burrowing. Birds called from trees nearby. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms and something deeper, life. "Welcome to your new home, George," Lily said, kneeling beside his crate. Her voice was gentle, tinged with emotion. "You're gonna love it here." Two sanctuary staff members helped Lily lift George from the crate. His legs wobbled slightly, he wasn't used to walking on real ground, but his claws instinctively dug into the soil, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the earth give beneath him. It wasn't rigid glass or cement. It was soft, alive. He took one slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. And another. Lily watched him go, her eyes misting. "He's stronger than we thought," she whispered. The sanctuary was a vast expanse of protected land nestled between rolling hills and quiet forest. It was home to all kinds of animals: rescued parrots that had forgotten how to fly, foxes born in captivity and never released, a wise old iguana named Clementine, and several tortoises like George. Each had a story, each had been hurt, but here, they were healing. George was placed in a spacious, outdoor habitat for large tortoises, complete with shaded groves, sunlit patches, feeding stations, and small caves dug into the earth. At first, he stayed close to the edges, unsure. He ate cautiously and spent hours just watching the others from under a bush. He wasn't afraid, they weren't aggressive, but he didn't quite know how to belong yet. The other tortoises seemed to sense this. They didn't approach him directly, but they lingered nearby when he came to feed. A quiet kind of company. One morning, George met Nala. Nala was a slightly younger tortoise, curious and bold, with a habit of gently nudging others with her nose. She had been rescued from a hoarding situation and had arrived at the sanctuary a year before George. Her shell had healed well, and she moved with surprising agility for her size. That morning, she approached George as he tried to wrangle a large leafy green into his mouth. She watched him struggle for a moment. Then, quite deliberately, she stepped up beside him, pushed the lettuce toward his face, and stared at him with quiet confidence. George blinked. She nudged the leaf again. "Here," it seemed to say. He took the bite. From that moment on, Nala became a regular part of George's day. She'd appear like a shadow behind him, bask in the same patches of sunlight, nap in the same shaded grove. Sometimes, she'd tap him gently with her shell, urging him to move a little faster, to keep up. At first, George was unsure. He wasn't used to anyone seeking him out. But over time, he began to respond. He'd follow her slowly across the habitat. When she paused to watch the wind rustle the grass, he paused beside her. When she dug shallow scrapes in the dirt, he dug too. Something was waking up inside him. Something more than just survival. Something like joy. The staff at the sanctuary noticed it too. "George has really come into his own," one of them said as they watched him from a distance. "He was barely moving when he came here. Now look at him, he's even started head bobbing at Nala." Lily came to visit often. Though her work kept her busy, she always made time for George. She'd sit just outside his habitat, watching quietly. Sometimes she'd talk to him. Other times, she'd simply sit in silence, content to see him thriving. "You've got a whole world now," she said to him once. "And you're finally part of it." George was changing. His shell, though still marked with old scars, was strong now. It caught the sunlight in a way it never had before. His muscles grew firmer, his gait steadier. He dug burrows of his own, sometimes even sharing one with Nala on colder nights. His appetite was strong. He developed a fondness for hibiscus flowers and would seek them out with almost single-minded determination. The first time he stole one from Nala's mouth, she gave him a look that said, "Really?" and then let it go. He had territory now, places he returned to, favorite spots under particular trees. His world was big, but he knew it, claimed it, and then came the storm. It was late autumn when the sky darkened suddenly. The staff had been monitoring weather reports, but the storm struck faster than expected. Torrential rain pounded the earth, and wind swept through the sanctuary in a deafening roar. Staff scrambled to secure enclosures, check on animals, bring some of the smaller, more fragile ones indoors. The tortoise habitat, designed to handle weather, had covered areas and deep burrows, but still, the storm rattled George in a way nothing had before. Thunder cracked above. Trees bent. For a moment, George froze in the open, uncertain. And then, he saw Nala disappearing into a burrow just ahead. George followed. The storm raged on through the night. Wind howled, rain lashed, but inside the burrow, George and Nala were safe. Side by side, they waited, sheltered by the earth. The instinct to dig deep and ride out the chaos had returned to him, passed down from generations of wild ancestors. In the morning, the storm was gone. The sanctuary was wet, but intact. Staff walked the grounds, checking animals, repairing what had been blown askew. When they reached the tortoise habitat, they found George and Nala already emerging, mud clinging to their shells, eyes blinking against the sun. "Looks like George knows what to do now," one staffer smiled. He did. Something had shifted after the storm. George was no longer the cautious observer, the outsider. He was fully here now, part of the land, part of the rhythm. He had weathered nature's fury and come through stronger. By winter's end, he was one of the most active tortoises in the sanctuary. He greeted staff with slow but purposeful movements. He and Nala basked together every morning. He dug deep, strategic burrows. He even chased a wayward squirrel once, at his own tortoise pace, of course. And all the while, George grew into the tortoise he was always meant to be. Spring arrived in the sanctuary with a kind of hush. Wildflowers bloomed in slow motion bursts across the hills, painting the land in soft hues of violet, gold, and green. The air was rich with new life, chatter from newly arrived birds, the distant thrum of insects, and the low rustle of grass in the breeze. And right in the middle of it all, under a broad-leafed tree warmed by early sunlight, was George. He was larger now, his shell smoother, stronger, gleaming faintly with health. He moved with deliberate confidence, no longer hesitant, no longer unsure. He'd become a figure of calm among the staff and visitors. Children who came on sanctuary tours would often stop to watch him for long stretches of time, fascinated by how slow could still be so certain. "George is like a wise old mountain," one girl said, scribbling notes in her journal. "He doesn't move fast, but it always feels like he's going somewhere." She was right. George had found his rhythm. Nala remained by his side, his quiet companion. The two were inseparable now, often seen basking together or moving in sync from one end of the habitat to the other. If George rested too long under a bush, Nala would nudge him out. If she went too far ahead, George would eventually appear behind her, munching on a dandelion as if he'd known the way all along. And while George himself didn't understand fame or admiration, it was clear the sanctuary had found a kind of gentle symbol in him. He was on their newsletter. A local artist painted his likeness on a community mural. A school named their garden Tortoise enclosure after him. People who met him carried his story home in their hearts. But what George knew, deep in the quiet center of himself, was peace. He had something few creatures ever found, a second chance at life. One evening, Lily returned. It had been months since her last visit. Work had kept her in the city, caught up in emergency calls and rescue missions. But now, with the early evening sun behind her, she made her way across the sanctuary grounds with a worn canvas bag over her shoulder and a warm, familiar smile. She stopped just beyond the tortoise habitat, watching from a distance. George was resting near a shallow pond, half submerged in the water, with Nala beside him. His eyes were half closed, content. "He looks happy," Lily said to a nearby staffer. "Happier than ever," the woman replied. "He's really settled in, knows every inch of the place. He even helped us find a broken irrigation pipe last week." Lily laughed. "Of course he did." They walked over together, and when George noticed the footsteps, he turned his head ever so slightly. He blinked, then blinked again. It had been some time, but he remembered her. Lily crouched low. "Hey, old man," she whispered. "Still causing a ruckus out here?" George didn't move fast, but he didn't need to. He ambled forward just enough to press the side of his shell against the mesh gate, as close to her as he could get. She smiled, reaching through to run her fingers along the curve of his shell. "I missed you too," she said. Later, the staff invited her to sit in the observation hut that overlooked the habitat. They brewed tea, shared stories about new arrivals, and told her how George had become an unofficial mascot. She listened with pride swelling in her chest. That night, Lily stood alone at the fence, watching George under the moonlight. The tortoises often slept beneath the stars, slow breath syncing with the pulse of the earth. George was still beside Nala, tucked in a shallow nest of dry leaves and soil. The sky above him shimmered with constellations. He didn't stir, but there was something in his stillness that felt more like presence than sleep. "I don't think you were just rescued," Lily whispered into the dark. "I think you were meant to be here." George didn't respond, of course. But the silence around him held a weight, a kind of quiet agreement. In the weeks that followed, George's life continued its steady rhythm. He wasn't a tortoise who chased change, he was change, in the slowest and most profound of ways. He became a mentor of sorts to the newer arrivals. A younger tortoise named Hugo often trailed behind him, mimicking his movements, sharing his shade. At first, George barely acknowledged him, but over time, he allowed the little one closer. When Hugo curled beside him one afternoon for a nap, George didn't move away. It was a small thing. But in George's world, small things mattered. Every season brought subtle shifts, different leaves, different sounds, the lengthening and shortening of days. George adapted. He ate what grew, wandered new paths, avoided flooded spots after heavy rains. The land was always changing, and so was he, in ways no one but Nala and the wind could see. And so the story of George the tortoise, once abandoned, forgotten, and sick, became one of the sanctuary's most quietly powerful tales. Not because he had done anything grand or dramatic, but because he had survived. Because he had learned to trust again. Because he had shown that healing was possible, even for the slowest of hearts. And because somewhere, out in the wide open space of a world without walls, George had found home.